Let's get started. We'll start with this, the creation myth. You see, in the beginning there was the Bob. And the Bob created liberalism. It sprung forth from his loins, or like Venus from the sea, in the mid-1940s. Before that, there was no liberalism. It was a desert wasteland. Well, this is the sort of convenient myth which people in the Liberal Party tell themselves far too often. But the simple fact is this: the liberal tradition in Australia is much longer, much stronger, and much richer than the creation myth which we foolishly ascribe around the Honourable Member for Kooyong. And the problem is largely to do with this fact, and that is winners write histories. Australian Nethercote have noted, and I quote, "Where liberalism has been the subject of research and study, it's often been at the hands of those influenced by and favourable to interventionist tendencies." One of the reasons for this is Alfred Deakin and Deakin's place in the Australian political development. It was not only Deakin's arch opponent, George Reid, who fell victim to this angle on Australian development, but it was also the policy of free trade and minimal interventionism which suffered a bad press. Now, I presume most of the people here would have heard of John Stuart Mill. Some may even have heard of George Houston Reid. But how many can honestly say they've heard of Joseph Carruthers or William Macmillan or Bernard Wise or Bruce Smith? If you have, that's better than I thought we would get. But these people were powerhouses of genuine classical liberalism. And while we all might have read On Liberty or The Wealth of Nations, how many have read perhaps the best early colonial work on a true, genuine classical liberal philosophy, not just practicality, but classical liberal philosophy, Bruce Smith's Liberty and Liberalism, which the CIS very fortunately published a number of years ago and may still be available. But I'll get onto Bruce Smith and Liberty and Liberalism a little later. Part of the problem we have with talking about liberalism and political liberalism in Australia has been the problem of definition. So, for example, you get historians talking about classical liberals or new liberals, free traders versus protectionists, conservatives versus colonial liberals or Deaconite liberals, or liberals versus liberals. And it's not helped when you have writers like Winsome Roberts who contend that, quote, "As an ideology and a worldview, liberalism occupies the middle ground between conservatism and socialism." That's entirely a gross mischaracterisation of liberalism, especially pre-Federation liberalism. Historian John Manning Ward misidentifies Reid and Carruthers as so-called new liberals when they are essentially classical liberals. Their lifelong antipathy to Deakin's policies being something of a giveaway, I would have thought. Nor do I accept Ward's assertion that, quote, "liberalism and conservatism have been virtually indistinguishable in colonial politics." Later, Ward himself falls into the Deaconite trap of calling classical liberals conservatives. Similarly, Greg Craven says that the founding fathers of Australia's constitution all fell within the range of what today would be referred to as liberal opinion. But that's only true to the extent that liberalism has been debased in its meaning by Deakin and his political descendants. Deakin himself said, and I quote this, "A colonial liberal is one who favours state interference with liberty and industry at the pleasure and in the interests of the majority, while those who stand up for free play of individual choice and energy are classed as conservatives." Now, to some extent, he's right. They sought to conserve the pre-existing classical liberal tradition in colonial Australia. The new liberals were clear that governments had a duty to intervene in fiscal, industrial and social policy in order to keep societies prosperous and secure. We must remember that at the time, it's sectarianism and protectionism, not socialism, and this is the immediate pre-Federation period, that were the major points of division. Again, Ward's incorrect to say that Federation was seen by classical liberals as a mean for the colonies to minimise the creeping menace of socialism. The battle was not at that stage with socialism, it was with the fiscal issue. How do you deal with taxation? How do you deal with free trade? And it's mirrored in this geographic divide between New South Wales and Victoria. Now, it's true that a lack of specie and limited investment options had seen all colonies call on government to develop ports, railways, education, roads and settlements. But by the end of the 1860s, it's New South Wales where manhood suffrage and the secret ballot were secure. The Legislative Council has been, although a nominated body, is effectively removed from power, and the prospect of a bunyip aristocracy has been seen off with short shrift. A reliance on agriculture meant that the vagaries of weather and demand produced fluctuations in fortunes, but consistent growth was a feature of both profit and wages. As Ward notes, liberalism was triumphant in New South Wales, and by this he means classical liberalism. Everyone with a political voice to use knew that it could be used. No one with a future to make had cause to fear that society would withhold opportunity. Land law amendments were being made. There was education for all who sought it. The economy was expansive. Men and women still migrated in hope, but not despair. The belief that the colonies allowed everyone a sure prospect of full personal development to the limit of his or her abilities had become entrenched. If the system failed in particular cases, that was attributed to human folly or gross misfortune, not to lack of opportunity in a colony where, it was thought, nature's law of individual freedom had been enshrined. Land was power, and Victoria had more severe problems than any other colony in unlocking its land from the grip of those colonists who originally possessed it. Victoria's serendipitous but short-lived gold rush and its inflationary consequences, combined with a lack of free land, spurred the growth of domestic manufacturing. Thus, Victoria had the highest rate of industrialisation, the richest trade, and the greatest per capita wealth. The largest employment in secondary industries in Victoria was in clothing, textiles, breweries, sawmills, tanneries, iron foundries, brickworks, potteries, and engineering establishments. But remember this, in 1861, in the immediate post-gold rush period, the average number of employees in Victorian factories was only 6 people. The average number was only 6 people. Imagine them competing with Manchester or London or Edinburgh. Tariff walls seemed the logical solution after the gold boom left the colony's economic well-being dependent on the continued proliferation of small, uneconomic firms. People like David Syme, the editor of The Age, led the vanguard. He attacked laissez-faire and competitive individualism and leaned towards state socialism. And he was a key influence on a young lawyer named Alfred Deakin. To say that all the colonies were liberal, in that they wanted rule of law, freedom of speech and religion, of the press and of assembly. But on economic matters, classical liberalism was hemmed in by the so-called new liberals like Deakin and the emergent Labor Party, both of whom viewed the interventionist state as highly desirable, even if for slightly different purposes. While liberalism in Victoria was moving down the path of protection and regulation, the 1890s was a golden era for free trade liberalism in New South Wales. The free traders of the era contained genuine theorists who opposed the extension of the powers of the state and developed a coherent and remarkably modern, even today, theory of liberalism. Bruce Smith is the greatest political theorist that you've never heard of, and I'll fight anyone out the back who wants to disagree with me. He deserves a place at this conference, if for no other reason than he went around pointing the finger at other people who called themselves liberals and denounced them as statists. The quote above I won't read out, but you can see that he's well within the rich tradition of classical liberalism of the time. And I can't do it justice, but I urge you all to wade through Liberty and Liberalism by Smith. You don't need to fully understand the historical events with which he engages, of which there are many, but simply revel in the philosophical defence of individual liberty as the true key to true liberalism. What then is the role of the state? Liberalism at the time was not a top-down imposition. It accurately mirrored across classes the way that people viewed their lives. Staley and Nethercote are simply wrong when they assert liberal approaches to welfare state have not differed substantially from those of their adversaries. The fact is that very substantial differences arose over methods of financing, the importance of self-responsibility and of persuading individuals to seek to provide for themselves, the centrality of the family in meeting community welfare needs effectively, and the value of private and voluntary organisations in the provision of services instead of preferential reliance upon government bureaucracies. Similarly, Ward is wrong to state only the most rigid conservatives and reactionaries thought that private charity and personal thrift should be preferred to increasing state action as solutions to growing social problems. In fact, Australia was one of the great successes of voluntary communalism. David Green and Lawrence Cromwell, who wrote Mutual Aid or Welfare State, Australia's Friendly Societies, make this point. At turn of the century New South Wales, this was not a hellish Victorian existence. 85% of all 85% of all working class families in New South Wales had access to full medical and pharmaceutical coverage at turn of the century New South Wales. 85%, not of middle class, not of upper class, 85% of working families had this coverage through voluntary communalism. But it's not a coincidence that the Commonwealth Age Pension was introduced by Deakin in 1908. Getting on to federation. The federation movements were multiple, not unitary. There was a battle waged between classical liberals, new liberals and the Labor movement concerning the role of the state in social and economic affairs. There was no single federation movement as such, but an opportunistic coalition of interest, all troubled by the 1890s. Craven contends that the final product, the Constitution, was a victory for free traders, and I tend to agree with him. The Australian Constitution as envisaged was a classically liberal document, but as Craven also notes, paradoxically, the external federal tariff adopted immediately after federation, and which was to endure for so long, represented the application of opposite tendencies. Well, how did this happen? Well, we had what I like to call the bad decade. In the very first session of the Commonwealth Parliament, Victorian protectionist Henry Bournes Higgins persuaded the House of Representatives to pass a motion calling on the states to transfer to the federal government the IR powers. It set the tone for this formative era, and Higgins, of course, would later be appointed to the High Court where he would write the infamous Harvester case. In the first decade after Federation, Deakin was Prime Minister for a total of 57 months, or almost 60% of the 10 years. And this was despite support for protectionists continuing to fall during that time, as you can see. Until the fusion of 1909, he was continually dependent upon Labor support. In chronological order, the Australian governments were, as up there, protectionist, 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 Labor, free trade for only 10 months, protectionist, protectionist, Labor. Exploratory discussions on more durable linkages were held between Labor and Deakinite protectionists in 1904, and even as late as 1908, just a year before fusion with the free traders. Now, Deakin was not a socialist, but he was certainly naive about its potential dangers, believing that at worst, socialism could only be carried out at the level of state government, given the limited responsibilities of the federal government. Contrast this with Reid and Carruthers, who better understood the so-called lines of cleavage. Socialism, not protectionism, was the enemy of the future. Carruthers understood this better than almost anyone in Australian political history at the time, and set about trying to form the disparate New South Wales Liberals into an effective political force. He never lost an election he contested. By the time Deakin understood the threat from socialism and sought amalgamation with the free traders, it was already too late. And when he did, he brought his ideological failings with him. I strongly contend that fusion was both the defining moment of right-of-centre politics in Australia, and it was a disaster for Australia. It would have been manifestly better for Australia were they had been allowed to die or to join the ALP. Deakin was, of course, the core of the Australian settlement. Craven poo-poos the idea that had he been born later, he would have been Labor, but I'll let you decide. Deakin wanted the power of the state to be used to guarantee minimum wages, old age pensions, free compulsory state education, redistribution of wealth by tax, and some legislation to cut the impact upon men and women of capitalist enterprise concerned with profits. As Ward notes, he continued to regard Labor and the New Liberals as natural allies. So what were the consequences? Well, Australian Republicans speak of a thwarted nationalism, but I believe we have a thwarted liberalism. 1909, the protectionists joined with the free traders to form fusion government. 1916, the ALP dissidents become part of the nationalist government. 1931, ALP dissidents joined to form the UAP government. In 1944, Menzies arrives on the scene, the ideological son of Deakin and ideological grandson of Syme. And by the 1970s, the end of the DLP and the infusion of Catholic Conservatives in the party brings some of that with them. Each event has dragged us back towards statism. What do we say about Bob? Well, Menzies is quite clear on this. We have no doctrinaire political philosophy. Where government action or control has seemed to us to be the best answer to practical problems, we have adopted that answer at the risk of being called socialists. Frankly, I can put it no better than Greg does in one of his works. Reid's advocacy of anti-socialism was the foundation for fusion, and yet the Liberal Party thereby created was defined intellectually by Deakin's statism. For the next 60 years, classical liberalism was not really central to Australian political liberalism, but a combination of Deakinite statism, populism and conservatism. If Australia is to survive another century, it's time for Australian Liberals to start learning about our past.
Thanks for that, Peter. As our next speaker, we have Dr. Zachary Gorman. He is a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, as well as an up-and-coming historian. So his specialty is the history of classical liberalism in pre-war Australian and colonial politics. And he's published widely in academic journals and the Quadrant, and his first book was actually a biography of Sir Joseph Carruthers, which Peter also mentioned. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zachary Gorman.
There is a traditional narrative of Australian history which argues that the country is naturally predisposed towards state intervention. The story goes that Australia was set up as a military colony designed to house convicts, and that therefore the government was heavily involved in people's lives from the get-go. Australia was a far rougher and more untamed land than the United States, so while rugged individualism suited the development of the latter, mutual cooperation was what was required in the bush. Huge outlays of state capital went into building railways and opening up the land, and an early partnership between public and private enterprise laid the framework for our economic success. Australia was home to great innovations in political liberty, including the secret ballot and a widely dispersed franchise. But the natural product of those developments was not greater individual freedom, but the election of working men into Parliament and the creation of a Labor Party. A partnership between that party and enlightened aristocratic liberals like Alfred Deakin turned Australia into a great social laboratory with high fixed wages, tariff protection, and preference for union members in government employment. Australia mastered socialism sans doctrine, socialism without the nasty Bolshevik edge, and became a working man's paradise. When US troops came to stay during World War II, they had to be given leaflets explaining our foreign socialist ways and why wharfies would stick rigidly to their union-determined maximum working hours, despite the fact that they were apparently fighting a war for national survival. Progress, defined as further state intervention, stagnated a little bit during the long Menzies era, but it had its renaissance with Whitlam. Hawke and Keating's economic reforms are seen as an aberration, which went against everything that Australia once stood for. Now, there are some points that the old leftist narrative for Australia gets right, but as a whole, it is part fabrication, part manipulation of the facts, and it cannot stand up to close historical scrutiny. Even many of its proponents will at least admit that the working man's paradise was inherently built on white Australia, and a deliberate determination to keep ethnic groups out because their hard work might undermine the cushy jobs and wages of unionists. The left now tend to shy away from the proud narrative that they once created for themselves, because it is, after all, a white man's narrative, which tends to ignore the fact that success was built on the dispossession of Aboriginal people. I would like to present to you a new narrative, based on extensive historical research, which argues that for most of the 19th century, Australia, and especially the mother colony of New South Wales, was a haven of classical liberalism, low taxation, and economic growth. This thesis is partly abstracted from my book on Sir Joseph Carruthers, so if it piques your interest, I would suggest you pick up a copy.
It's definitely worth it.
Let's start from the beginning. Australia was founded as a convict colony, but this did not beget a culture of subordination. It actually acted as a catalyst for opposition to the state. That convicts themselves were not naturally predisposed to submission goes without saying. They had been exposed to the harsh reality of an oppressive state which denied them their freedom and sent them halfway around the world to toil in servitude. Many convicts were Chartists or other political agitators who came to Australia specifically because they opposed the state. There were free settlers also tended to oppose the convict system. There were a handful of petty aristocrats who came to Australia because they could get cheap land and who were happy to exploit the free labour of convicts on their vast sheep runs. The majority of free settlers were, however, poor people who could not make a go of it at home, so they sought out the opportunities of a new land. Henry Parkes is a classic example. As a boy, his family had been forced off their ancestral farm, and after failed attempts to earn a subsistence wage in Birmingham and London, he came to Australia as a bounty migrant, eventually setting up a newspaper and entering politics. For men such as Parkes, the convict system undercut free wages and hurt the reputation of the colony. It was a great liberal political agitation spearheaded by Parkes and others, which led to the end of convict transportation and ultimately to the advent of democracy. In 19th century Britain, the left-right divide was fundamentally different to that which exists today. On the right sat the Tories, who supported the twin conservative institutions of a landed aristocracy and an established Church of England, accompanied by a paternalistic approach to government enshrined in tariff protection and the Poor Law. On the left sat the Whig Liberals, descendants of religious dissenters, who combined a mistrust of government with a Protestant work ethic, which tended to encourage capitalistic growth. Greatest amongst the latter group was William Gladstone, who tried to eschew the military entanglements of empire and focus on balancing the budget and reducing taxation. The politics of Britain were naturally exported to Australia, but Tory-style conservatism failed to take root. As migrants from the whole of the British Isles, Australians were too religiously diverse to support a single state-sponsored church. Similarly, attempts to establish a landed aristocracy failed because they could not be propped up by ancient tradition. When New South Wales was given its democratic independence with the advent of responsible government in 1856, there was an attempt to establish a hereditary upper house based on the House of Lords, but this proposal was heavily defeated. Within a couple of elections, any outwardly conservative presence was ousted from the Legislative Assembly, and New South Wales entered a golden age of liberalism, characterised by free trade, low taxation, and limited regulation. It was a period of tremendous economic growth, based largely on the trading centre of mercantile Sydney. Melbourne was given a golden goose in the form of Victorian mineral deposits, but New South Wales created its wealth through enterprise and agriculture. There were significant government outlays on railways, but there was a strong ethic that public works had to be remunerative and would only be built if they had a chance of making a profit. This was not always the case in practice, and pork barrelling was common, but there was a healthy amount of resistance to any increase in government spending. Most of the public works were financed not through taxation, but through the sale of crowned lands, hence taxation remained minimal. This aspect of the boon could not last, and eventually George Reid had to stabilise New South Wales finances through the introduction of direct taxation and the rationalisation of expenditure. It says much about the era that when Reid first proposed a very limited income tax, it was denounced in the Sydney Morning Herald as an invasion of personal privacy, for the government had no right to know what an individual earned. Despite these complaints, Reid's pragmatism was highly successful. His combination of limited necessary taxation with complete free trade saw the colony through the 1890 slump better than any of her sisters, and New South Wales entered Federation with an expanding population and a strong economy. Darkness loomed on the horizon, however. As I have said, Victoria's wealth came not through regular growth, but through the providential boon of the gold rush. When that boon ended, the colony searched for a new artificial mechanism for economic growth. Prodded along by the propagandising of David Syme and The Age, they appeared to have found one in tariff protection. Protection offered to force the creation of new native industries by making imported goods unaffordable. The consumer was to be sacrificed to the manufacturer, as was the agricultural industry, which would be forced to pay more for locally manufactured machinery. It was a difficult prospect to sell, particularly since protection remained associated with unpopular Tory conservatism. The sugar to coat the paid-for medicine was the so-called new protection. Tariff protection would only be given to industries that paid high union wages, and despite the fact that this would only exacerbate inflation and force those without cushy union jobs to pay even more for goods, the marriage of the protectionists and the Labor Party would soon be consummated. New South Wales went into Federation fully aware that it risked its successful free trade policy if it joined in union with its sisters. It was for that reason that it took 2 referendums for the colony to register a large enough yes vote, and on neither occasion did Sydney express her support. Still, it was hoped that as New South Wales would almost inevitably be given the first crack at the Prime Ministership, that position could be used to lead the country down the right fiscal path. Fate intervened, however, and Reid was defeated on the floor of the Legislative Assembly in 1899. This led to a shaky protectionist government in New South Wales and to Edmund Barton ultimately becoming Australia's first Prime Minister. The 1901 election was barely a contest. The government had been commissioned before the polls opened, and people were reluctant to inject party strife too quickly into the new union. Nevertheless, the government rapidly proceeded to introduce White Australia and the first tariff. In 1903 and 1906, the protectionists lost a significant number of seats, so that they became the smallest party in the House, behind both Free Traders and the Labor Party. But Labor kept them in office so that new protection and industrial arbitration could be implemented in full. Seeing that the growing power of Labor and its promise to, quote, nationalise monopolies and extend the industrial and economic functions of the state were a greater threat to liberty than protection alone, Reid turned his party into an anti-socialist party and acquiesced in a merger with a handful of the remaining protectionists. The price of that merger was having Deakin as the new party's leader, and in 1910, he led them to electoral disaster. Most of the Liberals who lost their seats in 1910 were former protectionists, and the party was able to regroup under Reidite Joseph Cook and steal a narrow election victory in 1913. Cook was ready to take the fight to Labor and called a double dissolution in the hope of ending the illiberal practice of preferencing unionists in government employment. Before the election campaign could begin, however, the First World War broke out. Cook, who had been trying to balance the budget inherited from Deakin and Labor, was defeated largely because he was said to have not spent enough on defence. The war snuffed out the opportunity to have an all-out fight over the size and scope of government which the early federal period had been building towards. An expanded federal government and losses of personal freedom were accepted as necessary to the imperial war effort. The war cast a long shadow over Australian politics, as the 1920s was dominated by the nationalists and questions of loyalty. The debate had moved on, and Deakin's new protection, which had never been popular outside of the Labor Party, as his election results repeatedly showed, was thus set in stone for the next 70 years. To classical liberals, this story obviously ends on a sour note. The point is to be made, however, that there was a moment when personal freedom and low taxation were not the fantasies of ideologues, but the political norm in Australia. The hope is that there is a path back to this situation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And as our last speaker, we have Professor Gregory Melleuish. He is a distinguished historian and political scientist and teaches history and politics. And he is the author of several books and has published in over 80 journal articles and book chapters. His latest book is called Despotic State or Free Individual, Two Traditions of Democracy in Australia. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gregory Melleuish.
Taking my cue from the famous socialism sense doctrine, the paper's entitled Liberalism Sense Doctrine, the 19th Century Australian Experience. It's the fact that in 19th century Australia, most people identified as liberals, which means it was a very vague and general term often, which is why colonies like Australia and Canada invented the term liberal conservative to balance out which liberals were slightly different from other liberals. But they also identified with the British ideal of being a practical people. The British never have identified as being intellectuals, and Australians never identified as being intellectuals. They identified they were doing a practical job in a new environment. What did this then mean for the liberalism which they professed and practiced? Well, the first thing you can say, it wasn't an abstract liberalism such as you find at the French Revolution in 1789. it certainly was not much concerned with matters of human rights. Their rights were the ones which they had inherited from their forebears, and I think this is an issue which has been touched on occasionally in commentary on Australian political life. But, for example, if you compare Australia to Canada, and I recently did a book review on a book about Canada, the Canadians are absolutely obsessed with rights, and they have a Charter of Rights. And Australia doesn't have a Charter of Rights, and it looks highly unlikely in the time being we'll have a Bill of Rights. So our liberalism, which in other countries is often defined in terms of rights, isn't defined in those sorts of terms in this country. And I think that's very important, and it certainly was the case in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, they were largely driven by necessity. And of course, this is a very Machiavellian principle. If you read Machiavelli, Machiavelli says people do things by necessity. And necessity is what drove them as a practical people to do certain things. And that influenced the sort of liberalism, I think, which they developed. So what then were the concerns of 19th century liberals? Well, I think at a social level, as was discussed earlier, there was certainly a concern with what could be called, in what's termed in England, self-help, in the sense that people did things for themselves, often through necessity. So if you're living in the outback, of course you're going to have to do things for yourself. You're not going to have the state there to pick things up for you. And besides which, as I'll say in a moment, the state didn't have the funds to do much in the 19th century either. And they came together to form voluntary associations. My wife is very proud of the fact that her great-grandfather was on the founding board of the Bligh Hospital. Now, that's the sort of things they did in the late 19th century. They got together to set up hospitals. They got together to do self-help organisations. And one of the big, I think the most damaging things that had happened in the 20th century was the fact that this voluntary principle, which is very good for most people, has been destroyed as this sort of welfare state has taken away the capacity for people to do things for themselves. So they dealt with issues were common to an area. This meant, as C.E.W. Bean recognised, and I don't mean his book on the First World War, I mean has anyone read On the Wool Track? Anyone ever read On the Wool Track? On the Wool Track was a book that Bean wrote about the wool industry in outback New South Wales in 1910. And he has these things, he says, the people of the outback, they have this marvellous capacity to be innovative and to make do with things and to create solutions to problems. And in a way, that's the spirit of the outback, which reflects a sort of liberal individualism where people are not being told to do things for themselves, to do things by the state. They're doing things for themselves. They have to come up with solutions. Again, that's driven by necessity. These days, of course, you can't do anything because they've got occupational health and safety telling you what you can and can't do. That wouldn't have made sense in outback Australia in the 19th and well into the 20th century. So that's the sort of thing. And interestingly enough, just mentioning John Stuart Mill, one of the people who, interestingly enough, quotes John Stuart Mill is William Morris Hughes in his book on the case for Labor. And Hughes, who's a Labor person in the early 20th century, actually says, the state shouldn't intervene in telling people how they should live their lives, what food they should eat, etc., and what they should drink. It's interesting to find that on the Labor side, at least at that stage, they hadn't yet been corrupted by the idea that the state should be a nanny state that tells us how to do things. Of course, Hughes himself had lived as a worker, out living rough. In fact, he slept out in the Domain in Sydney at one stage, apparently. The only Prime Minister who perhaps has ever done that. So liberalism then was associated with the capacity to do things, it was associated with good government, and it was associated with economical administration. They were also constrained by the necessity of raising money to actually run governments. Now, how did the New South Wales government, for example, finance itself between the late 1850s through to the 1880s? They actually did it through land sales. This is why, one of the reasons why they didn't have to tax very heavily. What happens in the early 1880s? They're running out of land to sell. That's why they have to come to terms with raising taxes. Of course, in Victoria, that ran out earlier, and they had a relatively bigger population, which is why they succumbed to David Syme and protection, I think, as a way of raising taxes. There was a very real problem. How do you raise money for government? And the governments didn't do an awful lot. This is just basic sort of services. One of the things they did do in New South Wales was Charles Cowper in 1859 dismantled the old official public administration. He got rid of the old structure that had come from the convict era, and he employed a lot of clerks who were a lot cheaper. He did this for economy. It was a lot cheaper the way he did it. He also did it for political reasons. It was political patronage. If you had a public service full of all these clerks, the politicians, they didn't believe in those days. And I think there's actually an argument for this. It isn't necessarily self-evident, the idea of a public service. The idea of political patronage made sense to them in those days. So the other things they did, they abolished state aid for religion, they abolished state aid for religious schools. But three things they did do, and I think are very important. One was the Land Acts. The Land Acts was the desire to create a society of smallholders through free selection. It was a disaster. Was it a liberal measure? Or was it perhaps a distributist measure? The idea was, well, if we're going to have a free society, then it's a good idea if as many people as possible own property. That's a good liberal principle, I suppose, in some ways. But in order to do that, of course, they had to attack the squatters, who were actually growing all the wool, that were producing all the money that made the colony profitable to live in. So there's an interesting question there. They introduced compulsory secular primary education. Now, was this a liberal measure? Now, Bruce Smith argued that, in fact, well, no, everybody should educate their children, but the state shouldn't be involved. In order to bring in secular education, they had to dismantle the denominational system. So they could have had a system where they perhaps subsidised religious schools. That is another possibility. But the one they chose was to create a compulsory primary education, one of the consequences of which, of course, was that monstrosity called the New South Wales Department of Education. So is that a liberal measure? And the third thing they did, in order to open up the lands, they built a railway network. Now, there were no people in New South Wales capable of having the money to build the railways. So they did, they borrowed money in London, and they built a rail network. Now, interestingly enough, one of the consequences of building a rail network was to create what has been described as the first large industrial production in Australia. Huge numbers of railway employees, many of whom were very good for purposes of political patronage. But they created a much more... So in order to create a free, open society, they had to build bureaucracies in the late 19th century. And that leaves me to these were all important matters. They were all practical matters. To what extent can the choices they made be described in liberal terms? I think that's something worth asking. To what extent? If the product of your desire to build a free society is that you start creating bureaucratic structures in order to do it. And I'll just leave a final point. Charles Henry Pearson, who taught Deakin, argued in National Life and Character that what he called state socialism in Victoria was the necessary and logical outcome of liberal imperatives. So you have to ask yourself in that regard, was that also perhaps the same in New South Wales? Did in fact the socialism without doctrines, which succeeded the liberalism without doctrines, come from the fact that liberalism, because it was so practical, the way they did things in the 19th century, ends up in that particular mould at the end of the 19th century. So I'll leave it there.